Hi and welcome back to Bike Speed. So this week we're going to deal with this Scott Foil road bike. The customer had brought this in because he had trouble with his gearing and they tried to adjust it from what I understand and it wasn't adjustable, so he brought it in. Asked us to service the bike as well. We did our initial assessment on this and actually this threw a curveball at us, which you'll see as we're going with this rear derailleur cable. That's actually why we didn't get a video out to you last week, but I'll explain that as we go. One thing I did notice while we were servicing this, I didn't actually really notice how bad these were when the bike was brought in, but just how stiff those headset bearings were. The bike will tramway when it's riding and it'll just won't ride nicely at all. So when I'm assessing this rear derailleur, I noticed the rear derailleur itself was very sticky on that pivot point there. I noticed the cable had been pulled out quite a few times. There was something odd there, which again, it was a curveball that I never actually realised just what was going on there until I started the job. So we've got the bike in now for servicing the cable and sort out the headset bearings, and so away we go. Initially we start taking the bike apart. At this stage I'm assessing everything. I was very aware with this bike there was a slight budget on this bike, so I couldn't just go absolutely to town. In an ideal world I would have done the chain set and the cassette itself I would have replaced. Look at the mud in there on that front brake. That's very common for those brakes to get a real build up of mud, so we're going to address that as well with a little trick along the way, which you'll see as we go with the video. So we get all these parts off, we clean everything up. Like I say, I was a little bit aware of a budget restraint on this bike, so I had to do this very sympathetically within budget. I think we're at the end of this video we created a bike that will do hundreds of miles before that budget needs to be extended. So we're getting all the brakes off, cleaning everything up. Again, I knew we needed to do this rear derailleur cable and I knew I needed to get this rear derailleur apart and really weigh up what was going on there with the pivot point on that not working quite correctly. Front derailleur actually wasn't too bad, a little bit grimy, but plenty of life in that one, so we'll put that through the ultrasonic cleaner, clean that up with all the other parts, and that'll look great when it goes back on the bike. Got the chain set off. We want it to fill the bottom bracket bearing. You can sometimes hear what they're like, but generally you can feel them as well. And now we start to remove this internal routed cable. We use a little cable guide there, it just helps me reroute the new cable. But right now I'm about to discover just what is going on with this bike. Suddenly I realise this outer is sliding in and out of the frame, and that's a cable stop, and it's snapped off right there. It's actually broken, so the cable is travelling through the frame. So as I gradually brought that out with my cable guide in there as I'm bringing it out, there's the end right on there, and you can see the cable is frayed below it. There's a lot of rust on the outer, so that has really corroded and deteriorated to the point where eventually the bike can't change gear. A lot of fraying up in the hood as well. That's quite common on this particular shifter. It's not uncommon for those to fray off there. So it may have been that it started fraying there, that travelled down the cable, caused that corrosion down the other end, and gradually you ended up with a bike that wouldn't change gear. So we put on order one of those frame fittings, and actually we ordered it on the Monday as the video should have come out last Wednesday, and it just didn't arrive. It went missing in the post. And in the end, the company was very, very good. They sent us a second set out so as we could get the video out this week. There was just this sort of week delay really on just that fitting for the frame that threw the video out for us. So unfortunately, we didn't have a plan B last week and we couldn't get a video to you. And that was the reason why. So now when we're taking this derailleur apart, another little curveball here was there was something snapped off. It was metal. I think it might have been the end of an Allen key that snapped off inside that derailleur bolt. So there was no way of getting it off, which meant in order to service this derailleur to keep it running with this pivot point, I took out the top jockey wheel, but I left that bottom one in. So we now sympathetically cleaned this without putting the frame of the jockey wheels in the ultrasonic cleaning. We just literally cleaned the pivot and the jockey wheel that we could get out and left the rest and did that by hand. So now we're putting everything into the ultrasonic cleaning that we're choosing to run through it. It's not the same with every job. Not every service has the same parts go through the ultrasonic cleaner. You know, like this one where the jockey wheel frame we couldn't put through. Things can change along the way. So now we're washing everything off after it's been through the ultrasonic cleaner before we'll then start our lubricating process and just making sure that we can get especially this rear derailleur working mechanically sound and perfect. The cassette, although it was worn and I did give an advisory that the cassette needed replacing, I still like to clean them up. You know, although it's worn, I want that to look nice when it's on the bike. I want this bike to present well. I want the mileage to be able to be done on what is remaining within that cassette in terms of mileage. So we wash everything down, same with the chain. The chain actually in an ideal world would have been replaced on this service as well. but I degreased it. It was thick with grease and grime. It wouldn't have worked at its optimum even in its worn condition. The same with this chain set. It wouldn't work, you know, if you clean everything up, the chain will run nicely on it and you will get your final life out of it. So next up, we're just lubricating. We've got some premium grease on the pivot point of this derailleur, so we gradually get all this back together, putting everything back in its place, and before just putting the little stopper that gives the tension on the spring just here, and then that derailleur now will flick back, so you won't get that slack in the chain that you would have seen in the before shots there. The derailleur itself wasn't flicking back on itself in the smaller gears, so you were getting slack. Again, that would affect your gear changing. That was the actual brief of the job, was that it wasn't changing gear very well. So not only did I sort out that cable, but I've also sorted out the derailleur, just to make sure that when this bike goes back to the customer, it is shifting at the absolute best we could get it to shift with what was presented to us when it came in. So even things like these skewers, we lubricate all those. They can stick in the axle, just a little bit corrosion, a little bit of water in there, and they'll stick and you won't be able to get them apart. So we lubricate all that up, lubricate all the brakes. You can see with all the pivot points. We anti-seize grease the threads, and a little bit of silicone on the little slider of the spring of the brake there as well. Next up, we're sorting out this headset. Line up the logo of the cap, adjust the headset. At this point, I recommended to the customer that he did actually replace that headset, and on agreement we actually then replaced that headset along the way. But between this filming and getting the part for the frame and everything else, I did the headset at that point, so it wasn't actually filmed, but it has been done. So the headsets are now nice, and the steering of the bike would be worlds apart from what it was. Next up, we clean down the frame. We'll always wash down a frame when we service it, but because we were doing the video and everything else and we had this little delay on parts, we decided to polish this frame up as well, just to really make it nice for the customer, and obviously just almost as a sort of an apology for the delay on getting this bike back to him. So we're just using an auto glint polish here. It's a resin polish. It's got lovely water resistance to it, in that the water will bobble up on the surface and won't soak through the polish, and it makes a world of difference, especially to a lovely gloss bike like this. Actually, the frame was in immaculate condition on this one, you know, so it's really going to bring that back up to its absolute best again. Next up, we just wash the wheel down. I like to sort of feel a wheel around, check all the spokes, just check it all out, make sure everything's okay, clean up this hub, re-lubricate it before putting the cassette on. Even your wheel needs a little bit of love and attention during a service, just to feel the bearings, maybe advise on them and so on. And then of course, you all know from the previous videos, I do like to line up the manufacturer's logo with the valve. Just makes finding punctures a little bit easier, and assessing whether a puncture has reappeared in the same spot on the tyre and tube. You can line everything up and you'll know exactly where it all sits. So we reline up that logo and get that tyre back together again. I always use plastic levers. You'll see those on the floor there next to me if I need those, because they won't scratch the wheel and they're just a little bit more sympathetic to everything. So especially carbon wheels and black wheels, plastic levers are great. And then we had this little bit of scuffing on here where the cable that I'm about to replace is. So we just put a little bit of vinyl on there just to take your eye off that scuffing, both sides, look, but also just to protect that paint or the lacquer from just getting any more damage through the cables rubbing up and down. And next up, we've got the new frame fitting, which actually I noticed they've changed. The original one was like a hard plastic. The new one was an aluminium. So obviously that's an improvement that Scott have made over the years, and made sure that they've probably had a few of those fail, and they've now turned those into an aluminium fitting. So that's what this bike got, so it was an upgrade. Cables all through. Now we can start putting that bike back together. So initially we just put everything together pinch tight, just with an Allen key, just beyond tight. Then we can adjust everything up on the bike, make sure everything's where it needs to be, before then we can run through with the torque wrench and give it that final tighten up. It's just a good way, because occasionally you have to take things on and off as you're doing a job, and if you haven't torqued it up, it makes it a little bit easier. Plenty of anti-seize grease on these fittings for the brakes. They're very prone to corroding in the holes, as the front one you saw get a lot of mud and debris in there. They can corrode up, so a little bit of anti-seize grease on there will make the world of difference to your next service. Not to this service, but next time when I want to remove that bolt, it's going to be an awful lot easier if there's some grease on there, just to stop that seizing up. And you'll see a final little trick that we put on that front brake just to help us for next time. So now on goes the wheels. We're really beginning to get this bike back together now, so we're going to be at the stage next where we can adjust everything up, make sure it's all perfect, make sure the brakes align. I also give those a little feather pull just to make sure that they're braking on the braking surface of the wheel evenly, so that the wheel doesn't flex across and make a strange braking feeling. So you can see I'm just checking here, the brakes front and back both working perfectly. Very happy with where the brakes were on this bike. And then we're finally at the stage where we can run through the bike with a torque wrench, and you'll see the importance of that. Look at this brake here, how loose that is. A good few turns on there before that reached the specified torque. If you're climbing or going downhill and you hit a bump or a pothole and that shifter turns on the handlebar, you're going to go off the bike. So it's very important to even torque things like your shifters to make sure everything is absolutely correct as it needs to be. Another little vinyl detail there on the bolt hole for the front brake. That'll just stop that debris going in there. And that again will make my servicing life next time an awful lot easier, because I'll take that off. I've got my fresh grease. That brake's going to come off next time without any problems at all. Even things like the chain set bolts, you can see a few of those are turning a little bit. Just a little torque up, just gets everything nice and taut and tight, but to the correct tensions on the bike, pedals as well. And before we know it, this bike is going to be absolutely as close to perfect as we possibly can get it. I actually really enjoyed doing this bike. It was quite a pleasure, although it took us a couple of weeks with part availability and what have you. The actual process and the little nuances and details that we did made it quite a pleasurable bike for me to actually service. So I did enjoy this one. Finally, we give that chain a little oil up. We're oiling the rollers. The rag along the bottom is running along those rollers, and you can see what difference we've made to this bike. It's now mechanically sound and perfect. This bike will be ready to go again. It was a long overdue service and I was absolutely thrilled with the results. So thanks for watching. Do like, do subscribe, do drop us a comment below, and hopefully parts availability being what it is, we'll see you again next week. Bye for now.